Morning. I'd like to preach to us this morning from the theme, Can Jesus Heal My Addict? Part one, we're talking about the addict, him or herself, and their dependency. Next week in part two, we'll talk about, Can Jesus heal my addict, my husband, my wife, my child, my son? And we'll talk about codependency. Addiction has been a national crisis for at least 200 years in this country. But after all of that time, it finally seems as though we are at a turning point in the way that we are approaching this crisis. We are starting to turn away from the war on drugs, which most often was also a war on drug users and addicts. And we're turning toward decriminalization, Colorado and Washington, legalization, and treatment. And turning away from incarceration. Right here in California, we've changed our laws on nonviolent drug users receiving treatment rather than incarceration. But in all of this crisis, in all of these decades, in all of these centuries, the church, the Christian church, has played a central role, an important role, not always a helpful role, but an impactful role nonetheless. Starting in 1873, the women's Christian temperance movement led the fight for alcohol prohibition. And one might ask, why would a women's movement start this cause or take up this cause? Well, women took up the cause because they were so often the collateral damage of the men in their lives who were addicted to alcohol. And so women took up the cause on their behalf. And even also because they had no escape. Divorce was not easily granted in those days. And women were less able, much less able than today, to live independently. And so many felt trapped and stuck, and this was their response. Now, the church was divided. The Methodist church and the Baptist church were the teetotalers primarily. They were against alcohol completely, prohibition. And then you had the Catholics and the Episcopalians. Quite a different relationship with alcohol. The women's Christian movement went so far as to suggest that alcohol should not be used in communion because in no possible way could a poison become the sacred body of the Christ. So they got down on a theological level. I remember when I went to seminary, I grew up Methodist, and I went to seminary, and they have chapel in the service. And I remember really the first time I saw this, we had communion in the chapel, and after service was over, several people went up to the communion table and started eating the bread, and more scandalously, started drinking the wine. I was shocked. I was absolutely undone. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And later on, I found out that one of the people there was a United Church of Christ minister, so I thought that's a good church. But the women's Christian temperance movement fought and fought and fought until finally they succeeded in 1919 in passing the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, making the manufacture, sale, or importation of intoxicating liquors unlawful. This was the original Just Say No campaign. And a campaign it was. And they tried everything. They tried every message. Here you have the poor children asking people to vote no. Then you had the man riding his bottle over the cliff, over the waterfall, into destruction. They posed the big fat liquor barons. You can think Joe Kennedy et al. And Mr. Seagram, the big liquor barons who were making millions of dollars off the importation and sale. They posed them against the poor women and children who were the victims of their husband's alcoholism. And finally, they pulled out all the stops. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Made it a choice, either alcohol or sex, you choose. Fortunately, in 1933, the prohibition was overturned. While they succeeded in the law, they completely failed in the results that they desired. Just like all just say no approaches, prohibition failed. Now, the good news about this whole movement was that the temperance movement identified alcohol and alcoholism and addiction as a serious problem for our society. And while at that time the plethora of drugs that we now see were not available, what they were doing and what they were saying applies equally. I mean, it's always fascinated me why we even bother with the phrase drugs and alcohol. Alcohol is a drug. Nicotine is a drug. But because we continue to consume alcohol among polite society, we have to make this bifurcation, so we have adopted this phrase, drugs and alcohol. And now that marijuana is being legalized in state after state, I guess we're going to have to extend the phrase and say drugs, alcohol, and marijuana. And it's just absurd when they are all drugs. But it raised the profile of the problem of addiction in our society. That's their enduring contribution. The bad news was that they did not have a program of recovery for the persons that they were addressing. They only had a rhetoric of religiosity and moral condemnation. They had no medical or psychological understanding of addiction. And this moralizing and evangelizing alienated millions of suffering addicts from their families, from their communities, and from their church. Fortunately, in 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous was founded by Mr. Wilson and Mr. Smith. What Alcoholics Anonymous brought to the nation and to the world was a program of recovery for the affliction that so many were suffering. They understood it was a matter of life and death. But they understood that moralizing and Christian condemnation did not affect the change that was desired. And so the Alcoholics Anonymous program brought about a different approach. And there are 4 key insights that I see in the program. Number one, the number one insight was that alcoholism addiction is an illness rather than a sin. That was fundamental to shifting the approach and putting people on a path to recovery. Number 2, this illness is rooted in a psychological, mental obsession that required total abstinence. Number 3, key insight, it takes one to reach one. that all those high and mighty Christians preaching from their pulpits about the evils of alcohol and drugs reached no one, but an addict could talk to an addict and reach them and move them and guide them on the path to recovery. Number 4, they opened up the idea that one can choose one's own concept of God. So many had been burned and brutalized by the Christian God that they could not have any kind of Christian notion of the God that was offered to them, and so they rejected God altogether. Alcoholics Anonymous said you can have your own concept of a higher power because they saw that as essential to recovery. Number 5, the bondage of an addictive disease cannot be cured. That's the insight that they bring. That's why at every meeting they start off with, I am and I am. 5 years or 50 years, I am and I remain. This last insight is where the AA movement turned right and the church turned wrong. The story of the gospel is very interesting. They bring this young man to the disciples, and they cannot cure him. And so then Jesus comes along, and the Father brings them to Jesus himself. And immediately when Jesus casts the demon out, before it leaves him, it throws the young man on the ground, twirls him around, causes him to foam and writhe, and all of these things are going on. And Jesus is sitting there talking to the Father, says, how long has he been like this? And the guy's just rolling around on the ground. And then he tells him, come out. And he lays there as though he were dead. The Christian church saw in this the ultimate and continuing possibility of a cure. I see in this story a beautiful metaphor for recovery. It takes a young man, throws him on the ground, takes a young woman, throws her into convulsions. They writhe around for years until they're almost dead. And then recovery for them is like resurrection. The disciples failed to cast out the demon, but Jesus succeeded. And the final word that Jesus speaks to them, this kind can only come out through prayer. You know, I love the Father's response. That's why I've always liked this passage, because that Father is all of us. I believe, but help my unbelief. It is the admission that is, in spite of how hard we want to believe, we still have that hole of doubt that stays with us throughout. But the church has ever since preached the message that if you pray enough, Jesus can heal your addict. And praying alone is not a program of recovery. But the success of the 12-step movement is rooted in the total surrender to the reality of one's addiction and the surrender of your addict to your higher power, however you conceive of it. But this is the other important point. Surrender is not cure. Surrender is not cure, but surrender is freedom. Freedom from the control of the addict mind, freedom from the control of the addict body, freedom from the control of the addict soul, freedom to admit who you are rather than being enslaved to the impossible struggle to be and become someone you are not. Some people can drink alcohol. Some people can use cocaine. Some people can use marijuana. And some people cannot. If you know you are one of those people who cannot, then you know what not to do. And the AA movement has made a contribution to the world and in many other categories. You see all of the 12 groups we have. It's also had an insight for not only substance abuse, but other behaviors. And so there's Gambling Anonymous, and there's Sex Addicts Anonymous, and there's Overeaters Anonymous, and these are all behavior-based addictions. They understand that this program of surrender is not cure, but it is sobriety. It's not a cure, but it is sobriety. Cure is a once and forever moment. I had appendicitis, I had an appendectomy, and now I'm cured of my appendicitis. That's a cure. But sobriety is not cure. Sobriety is not a once and forever moment. Sobriety is a one day at a time. Chuck was preaching my sermon. Sobriety is a one day at a time pursuit of sanity and serenity. A cure is administered by someone else. The doctor cures you. Someone else treats you. The nurse cures you. Sobriety is something you do for yourself. No one can do it to you, and no one can do it for you. So no, Jesus cannot heal your addict. And we disciples of Jesus, who call ourselves the church, we cannot heal your addict. But we can give you love and support in your journey, not condemnation. We can open our hearts and our building to make room for your life-saving, sanity-restoring, and sobriety-giving 12-step meetings. I am moved every week just to pass by those gathering in our spaces. We've doubled the number of 12-step groups that we host just in the last 18 months to 2 years. Prior to that, the schedule of the meetings was such that I rarely encountered people. The meetings were at night or on the weekends when we separate church night, board nights from other nights. So we never had any interaction. Well, they've grown to the point where I can't help but at least see them gathering. And it's been amazingly powerful just to watch the hope, the sheer thankfulness and gratitude that people have just to be able to come to a meeting. It's impacted me tremendously. And so, no, we cannot heal your addict, but we can help in these ways. For as Jesus said, or to paraphrase Jesus, this kind can only be cast out by your higher power. Let the people of God say, amen.